That would not be good for Jeremiah. All right, so we're just starting recording Jeremiah. Be sure to look at all the assignment schedule and let me know any questions that you have. For this first hour, I want to deal with, I put the topics race, abortion, euthanasia. What we're thinking of is we're created in the image of God. We're here to glorify him and to do his will, but there are distortions that we have, misunderstandings. We can even call it rebellion, seeking to pervert and destroy the image of God in people. Evangeline in the middle is going to bring us back to, what does God say about male-female marriage? But then even there, we're going to hopefully touch on questions that you would have about that issue that we need to respond to biblically, theologically, so that when you write your statement, you've got a good, this is what God's will is concerning this topic. And that's what I'm thinking for these that are, I don't want to say they're a negative topic, they're issues we have to deal with. End of life, everybody dies, short of our Jesus coming back soon. But yet there are those that change that. Euthanasia, definitely abortion is an issue there, the baby in the womb. And that first topic of race, critical theory, how we see people differently than God created us is what we think of. So when you talk to someone, what I'm envisioning and why, I thought we should focus on these topics are, I want you to write a statement so you can have that, it's not a doctrinal statement for these topics tonight more so than any other topic, but yet it is a statement. We got to speak biblically, theologically correct, meaning we're bringing together all God's information together. What would I say to this whole issue? And whether it's one of these three or the one that we do at the end of the evening, Damon's going to look at a few others there for us there. But let me just dive in. Tom Borain, one of the former professors here, good friend. Now I said, where did I put it? Oh, yes, there it is. He did a presentation a number of years ago. We had a conference, Council on Dispensational Hermeneutics, was held here back in 2019, and he made a presentation on the myth of racial reconciliation. I don't know if you remember back in those years, there were some conferences, there was a statement written, and I forget where it was from, Chicago, or a number of theologians came together and talked about social justice. That was a big writing topic. But Tom, in his article here on the myth of racial reconciliation, used a cute illustration here. He said, one of my favorite programs in the 60s was Star Trek, the original series. I remember one episode, and I wasn't a big Star Trek fan, so I don't remember this episode, but that's a ways back. I remember one episode where Captain Kirk and the crew encountered a new civilization, which was also experiencing racial conflict. But in this case, the sentient beings were both black and white, but not one or the other. However, some were black on the right side of the body, white on the left side. Others were black on the left side of the body, white on the right side of the body. Each one thought that they were superior to the other. There was constant conflict between the two. A different kind of racism needing racial reconciliation. Do you remember that? Did you ever see that?
Yeah, I've seen that one.
Yeah,
I think by the time they got to that episode in the storyline, apparently those two races, they were down to their last two, and I think they blew the planet up or something. So it was just the last two that kept fighting over the
never saw it. All right, I'm sure they were trying to pick up on the times and depict it in another way and get us to think and evaluate about what's going on. There's a number of issues that are involved here. I don't know what to touch on in one sense. There's always been racial tensions everywhere since the fall, everywhere since, the flood there. We're going to talk about that just briefly. But now we're talking about critical race theory, social justice. We've gone from just a few years ago, multiculturalism, where it seemed to be that the powers that be were saying we need to be all one people. All right, is that wrong? No, it's not. Is what some of their motives were? Yeah, that's right. was wondering about. But now we're back to a division of ethnicities, races, and it's not just black and white. It's a whole bunch of other issues that are out there. Why? How would we process this as a Christian theologian? Somebody wanted to speak a biblical worldview to that. What are we getting wrong? The second part of this hour I want to focus on is the issue of abortion. Yeah, it's just an accepted thing in our culture now. I just saw a statistic the other day about some different generational perspectives toward abortion. And I think they were talking about the younger generation, in their 30s, 40s, where Roe versus Wade has been their whole life. And all the arguments that they've heard, pro and con, and the differences of opinion there, it seems like a vast majority, a significant majority, 60, 70% of the culture in America anyway, says it's a right that a woman should be free to exercise. All right, we have to address that. Euthanasia becoming mainstream more and more, a right to choose. Again, it's where it's framed, a right to dignity. How do we respond? Now, this isn't an ethics class, but yet it's touching on ethical issues. We got to think that through. Biblical ethics, but we're not going to spend our time thinking in that vein how to approach that. But yet, that's the kind of thinking. Let's talk about that whole. And I'm titling this race. Where do the races come from? Now, I say race. What are we really talking about when we say that? Anybody?
Talking about ethnicity.
Ethnicity, yeah, that's the biblical term. Different ethnicities. When you look how that word has been translated in the Bible, most often it seems to be associated with nations because there were ethnic groupings. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't some blending and some interracial issues, and there were throughout history. But where did it come from, these ethnic differences? Where do they come from?
Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel. Well, it's not real clear, but that's best understanding. Could have come before that, though.
Wasn't it after the fall? Noah's children.
It was Noah's children. You're very right there, Ben. Those that study genetics identify three major dominant ethnic groups. And you trace the lineage that's in the Bible, then that seems to where it goes back to. Now that's not true around the world, but yet you got blending everywhere because people have moved and migrated and all the rest around the world. But yet there is a demonstrated scientific observation that there are three different groupings that some went south from the Middle East. If you're saying wherever the ark ended up, there in Turkey is what we say on the eastern side of Turkey. Some went south, some went east, some went northwest, and that's Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Moved around, and we have their lineage, and it actually describes that. If you got your Bibles, the lands that they went to. So here's our biblical chapter 10 in Genesis. These are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, Japheth, the sons of Noah. And it starts out verse 2 with Japheth. And he went to Gomer, Magog, number of other places mentioned. Jump on down to Ham in verse 6. Japheth, Ham, and he went to Cush, Mizraim, Put, Canaan. And then down in 21, Shem, the father of children of Eber. All the older brother of Japheth. Children were born, sons of Shem. And he goes on. And at the very end of the chapter, these are the sons of Shem according to their families, according to their languages. Verse 32, these are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies, by their, there's that term in New American Standard, nations, but it's really ethnicities. And out of these, the nations are separated on the earth after the flood. Is this a result of sin? Doesn't seem to be. It's just a natural movement of people, but we don't see an ethnic diversity, but yet we hear the wording for it is all we're observing here. Chapter 11, you mentioned the Tower of Babel, and there we see a problem. What was the Tower of Babel's problem? What was the problem with the people at the Tower of Babel, is the way you're saying it?
They're not trying to spread to the whole land, but they trying to place in one place.
They didn't spread out. God wanted people to scatter all over the whole earth to reflect his image. Even though we're fallen people, he still wanted us to go out because we still bear the image of God. We were talking about that. Verse 4, you're very right there, Mashashi. Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach to the heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name. We're supposed to honor God's name, not theirs. Otherwise, we'll be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down and scattered them. Verse 8. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. And from there, the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. All right, that's some other observations we could make in the passage, but that's sufficient to say, at this point, sin was involved, scattering. What man wanted to do, keep everybody together. God says, no, I intended to fill the earth. Yes, they were starting out in different directions. If we take it chronologically, chapter 10 comes before chapter 11. Maybe there's a building history there after they scatter as well. But they're doing wrong. They aren't staying together. They needed to be over the earth. The question maybe to jump up to us is thinking of ethnicity, thinking of our racial heritage, if we could use that term. Is that a good thing, bad thing? Why would it be good? Why would it be bad? Again, I'm using a broad word there with good or bad, broad words. Just think of the context in which we're at. We have scattered around the world. We have different ethnicities. Yeah, good, bad. What are you thinking? Damon, you're going to have to step out on us. Jump in. What do you think on this?
What do I think about the fact that there are different ethnicities, or
was that a good thing that God wanted to happen, or was that a bad thing that he caused to happen?
No, I think it was a good thing to happen because it was God's intention for that to happen to begin with.
Where do you see an intention before what we said here? I mean, different ethnicities.
The ethnicities in particular, specifically? Like, I think those are just, I don't know that there's a scriptural reference to, like, how are we going to define ethnicity? Is that just a cultural term that we're using right now? Or is that more than just the cultural norms and mores and stuff of a people group?
Well, go ahead.
Because I think we could discuss this in two different ways.
Okay. Yes.
But what I see is with God's command for mankind to be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth, for ethnicity to be different in different places of the earth, I think would just have happened naturally anyway. Because as we understand the earth, if it was anything pre-flood like it is today, you have different weather patterns and different geologies and ecologies in different parts of the earth. So life would look different from place to place, and people would adapt to those places accordingly. And being apart from each other and separated, language is going to change from area to area. Customs and culture will change from area to area. So I see all that happening within the intention of God in the first place.
Okay. What's the second way that we would need to discuss this, though? You said there were two ways.
So in terms of, yeah, ethnicity, when we relate that to, say, specifics of culture, and like minimize those specifics into like skin color, or speech patterns themselves, minimizing, yeah, personhood in that in some ways. But ethnicity is the way we use that term today, or at least the way I understand that term to be used in our culture today, is really talking more about the outward, not expressions, but the outward view of where culture originates. And that is predominantly here in the United States, a skin color issue as defined by race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dr. Borain in his paper points up, he says there's only one race, the human race, when you think of creation. So what you're talking about there, Damon, is true. And the differences are really just the degree of the amount of melatonin in our skin. There are other things that have developed as people move in different areas. I'm assuming there was some adaptation that came as people were in different areas that develop different characteristics, eye characteristics and body size and whatnot. But when it comes to what we are as people, we're all the same. But yet, when we talk about this issue of our different ethnicities, nation fights nation, and quite often that's an ethnic thing. You can think of the differences. So how do we address, do we minimize race? Is race ever appropriate and biblically good? Galatians 3:28 is a verse that people pull out for a couple reasons, and they both apply to tonight, the ones I'm thinking of, maybe others. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, neither male nor female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. Does that say that the redemption that we have in Christ, though we were scattered, though our languages are different, and that in itself perhaps created some tensions, some rivalries, even we could say, different nation states. Is Christ intended to get rid of all those? That's a question that we have that comes up.
Well, if you want to argue that Christ abolished, excuse me, I'm back there. If you want to argue that Christ abolished Jew and Greek in the verse, you would also have to argue that he abolished male and female, and now we're all just the same thing.
And some people do that too. There's the other.
Yeah, but you see, if we don't want to concede that, well, then you actually have to ask what's Paul talking about here. And he's saying that that we're all in the verse where you're all one in Christ Jesus. So what he's arguing is that the gospel actually transcends cultural differences and language barriers, and it's not that it talks about male and female. It's not that the gospel is available to men and not to women, no matter who in history has bothered to argue that. He's not diminishing the reality of different cultures and stuff. He's arguing that Jesus saves people from every culture.
Right. Context is not saying what I was implying with my question to get us going there. So it's true of both of those things. Anyone else have a comment, observation on that one? Because that's a question that will come up in this area. So how do we... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I like that word that Josh used, transcends. I mean, when we think of God as a youth pastor, I was always wanting to help my students understand that one way to think of God is more than, right? We have our way of thinking and our way of applying our understanding to any given situation. How would God think of that? Well, it would be more than what we could bring to the situation or the thought. And for these verses to identify that what the gospel brings to humanity is more than any specific person group or gender or position within society. That like it's transcendent. It's just such a beautiful idea.
Mhm. All right, let's come back and push it back a little bit, though. Israel sought racial purity. Was that a good thing, a unique thing? You know, we're not Israelites, and we're not in Jews in the land trying to reconstitute the nation at all. So we maybe can't identify with some of the things that they see in the Old Testament. Nehemiah 13, I know it's priests, and maybe that's what we'd say is the uniqueness of it. He told them to get rid of their foreign wives, if you remember that. Is there, the question I had down, what of Israel's ethnic purity? Is that a unique thing? Let's start with that question.
I think it's kind of yeah. Got to be careful what you say, right? Because there's so much in the law that protects the alien resident within Israel. There's so much within the law that looks out for the non-Israelite individual that is a part of the community. And so we have to ask the question to your question, Dr. Dodds, uh, where did this idea of racial purity originate from? And as I understand the Old Testament, it's about an issue of idolatry. Every time that intermarriage was discussed in the old, well, I shouldn't say every time, those passages I'm aware of where intermarriage was discussed throughout the Old Testament, it's a discussion of these people leading you away from the worship of the true King, the true God, Yahweh. And that was always the case. When intermarriage did take place, idolatry became rampant within the community of the Israelites.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying, just to summarize, Damon, would we need to say Israel's sort of a unique antitype or type, and Christ is the antitype? That meaning they're trying to stay pure and holy because they're representing Christ, and that is that the issue?
I think it's definitely,
Race
I
is
think it
just
speaks into it. Yeah.
okay.
Actually, I wrote a whole paper for Old Testament class on this. One of the clearest texts that deals with the intermarriage on it is in Exodus 34, picking up in verse 10. And he said, "Behold, I am making a covenant before all your people. I will do marvels, such as have not been created in all the earth or in any nation. And all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their asherim, for you shall worship no other God, for the Lord whose name is jealous is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and when they whore after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and you are invited, you eat of his sacrifice, and you take of their daughters for your sons, and their daughters whore after their gods, make your sons whore after their gods. You shall not make for yourself any gods of cast metal," and then he starts going into the list of things they're not allowed to do. But if you look, yes, there's a clear command that there's not to be intermarriage, but it's a very specific reason for that, and it's not an ethnic thing, it's a religious thing. It's specifically that they were not to engage in the Canaanite religious practices. And apparently, when I did research on the passage, it's not even just intermarriage that they're talking about here. It is actual debauchery that was happening in the idol worship that was in view, apparently based on the words that were used. So it's not just that there was to be no intermarriage, it's that there was to be no idol worship and none of the debauchery that went with that.
So there's something that would be a negative influence.
Mhm.
That's what you're saying there. Okay. So where are our questions? I'll look at our time here. We way too much time on one topic here. We're trying to think of how do people in our culture think incorrectly about other people? And one of the things we do is all the craziness we have with these different issues relative to race. But thinking practically, if I can do that, should Christians, I've read articles by Christian theologians who say, if at all possible, we should intermarry with different races so that we typify the, I don't know whether I'm fair in saying one people of God, racial differences, again, not using that word differences, but racial differences should not be matter. In fact, they actually were encouraging that. And I've read a number that have said that. Is that true? Let me ask a question another way. I've also run into families that with the multiculturalism, they have a problem with intermarriage for their kids, not anybody else. They're saying, here we're talking about another issue. It's okay for somebody else, but not me. But yet they've got to ask themselves biblically, is their attitude racist? Which is what we have a default label. That if you want to preserve your ethnic heritage, you're being racist. And a family has to check themselves. Am I just wanting grandchildren and children, or my grandchildren, who look like me, or whatever phrase you want to put there? Is that necessarily wrong, bad? I want to counsel them as a Christian in this culture, knowing all, like Damon said, all the sensitivities that we have here.
We somehow, so far as I can remember in our conversation today, have not somehow distinguished between like ethnicity, like your skin color, and your cultural background.
Yeah, see,
So
I'm painting them too narrow, and you have to include all those things.
Well, yeah, but even like the question you just asked, is it okay to want your like national background to exist, or like keep going? Well, I would say if your problem is skin color, then you're probably being what we usually refer to as racist. If it's you want some of the family traditions to pass along, one of the strengths that these multicultural homes seem to have is that they take cultural background from both sides, if that makes sense. So it's not just if it's if it's the skin color issue for the grandkids you're concerned about, well, that's one thing. Another to say that I want them to carry on whatever the family Christmas tradition is because it's just a family tradition. Or I want them to eat the food that my grandmother, like I want them to use my grandmother's favorite recipe from apple pie or whatever. It's not one.
An example I think of in Chicago, I was raised in the Chicago area, and there's some sections of Chicago, and they aren't the racial tensions that we have today. They were more like Italian and Slavic and German, so there wasn't a skin issue. Yeah, there might have been some genetic facial presentations or whatever, I don't know. But there were a lot of tensions there in Chicago over the years back when immigrants were settling in the Chicago area there. How should we respond though? Would it be okay for a Christian couple to encourage their children to marry within our genetic line or not?
The Bible talks about do not be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. So I would argue that Christian parents dealing with Christian kids should strongly encourage them to marry Christians of the opposite gender. Like that's the clear biblical one man, one woman, Christians. That is what a Christian home is built on. Anytime you start adding And then obviously, like, there might be like doctrinal issues that are related to like Christianity. Like, I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, I don't have kids, so I can say whatever I want here and not a crow yet, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend to my kids to go marry some Pentecostal, you know, jumping around, spouting Latin words that nobody understands. But at the end of the, I mean, that's maybe not something I would recommend, but nor can I prohibit it, obviously, to some extent, because eventually they're an adult, they can decide what they want. I mean, legally, that's how it works. But when you start putting cultural and things that are not related to doctrine, but just pure culture, I'd say you're walking beyond what the Bible
I'm
gives
not
you.
trying not to think of that, because there are some issues relative to in Revelation 21. It's an interesting comment here, and I'm just trying to paint the continuum, and we maybe need to draw this to a close so we can talk about the other two quickly here. Yeah, just these other two perversions of the image is what I'm thinking of here. We emphasize race now. We're at a place where we're divided by race. Critical race theory divides us on the basis of race. We're oppressor oppressed. And that's in not just black and white. It's a number of different ethnicities here. In Revelation 21, verse 22, I saw no temple there, the Lord Almighty, and the city had neither the sun or the moon. Verse 24, the nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. So they are going to be involved. The nations, verse 26, will bring their glory and honor into the nations of it. So there will be some, I'm going to use the words ethnic diversity here, seen. And how do we get there? And maybe I'm reflecting a little too much on the multiculturalism, which we've sort of gotten past to, but yet we're now in a frumpy area even past that, where ethnicity is not a significant thing. Even your genetic presentation is not a significant thing. To wondering, so what is here? Is it just a cultural differences, or are there really some genetic differences there? Because I have run into families that are, you know, I want my grandchildren to look like me. Now, I'm two would ask the same thing. What are you saying, and what's the reason for that? What's the motive behind that? But where are we being influenced by the culture, and where are we needing to influence, and how? You know, let me summarize with Dr. Bahrain's, and then see any other comments. Dr. Bahrain's comments at the end of his paper: all humans, any physical and biological, are physical and biological descendants from Noah's three sons. We all are. All humans are in the image of God. All humans belong to the same family, the human race. All humans are sinners in need of reconciliation to God. And I had here some material about critical race theory I was going to touch on just briefly, because that's where they go off. All humans are loved by God. Now that means he loves us and wants us to come to salvation, not that he loves us as we are in our sin. Throughout eternity, God will be glorified in diversity within the human race. And so therefore, race, ethnicity, now this is a statement Tom didn't make, but I'm taking, I think it's a position, it's not bad. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I have to deal with it. The CRT, this one article here by John Stonestreet, they're talking specifically about critical race theory. It said he's using the term woke. Wouldn't make any sense unless you read it. You know, we Christians are, like, we in a sense got caught up in the multiculturalism move. Again, nothing bad about it. There's some good things about that, but yet there was some bad elements that were present in it. All right, I'm talking about critical race theory, which the current iteration of racial tensions, it rejects any universals that unite humanity, including the image of God. When it comes to understanding sin, what's wrong with the human condition, it sets it into a binary. Those that are right, the oppressed; those that are wrong, always the oppressor. And unfortunately, they tie that into race, someone's background. Critical theories lack an adequate understanding of salvation there too. And so the final one is this: wokeness, as he used in the title, is built on a worldview without salvation and offers an eschatology with no hope, where we can live and see beyond these things that we have put up to divide us, and race is one of them. All right, comments, others that haven't weighed in here. What I'm you're needing to clarify for this statement in your doctoral paper here. You're going to have a number of statements about people. It's just a paragraph. Put them all together. Unless for you in your context, you need to specifically have a statement about abortion or euthanasia or race, or maybe there's something else in this area. Well, I'm seeing we've talked about what the Bible says about how we were created and what we're to image in the world and how we're to live in the world. How do we pervert it? And what's the statement we can make coming back at them? That's what I want you to do. Just that one paragraph, because you got a whole bunch of them to write about. Does that make sense? Confuse anybody of what we're going to do here? Question anybody on what to write in this one?
So you're saying, Dr. Dawes, that when writing the doctrinal statement, we are to kind of somewhat speak in general in terms of those topics, abortion, race, and euthanasia within that paragraph of that topic that we're covering right now.
Yeah, if you wrote on all three of them, you'd have a big paragraph, which is fine if that's what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to focus on just one of them, because for my context, I'd like to think this through and say it. So you could write on just one of these three. Same thing at the end. Damon's going to talk about three different topics, but they're all sort of related. That makes sense there, Ben?
Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to say, like, in response to your question, because in terms of America is different in terms of we really polarize ethnic background, races, and so when topics like we're discussing tonight come up, especially when talking about race and ethnicity, I believe that especially when you ask the question about parents, should they expect their children to marry within the same ethnic background? I think when you start making restrictions in terms of who you should marry and what ethnic background they should come from, I think it takes God out the equation, and then you show a lack of trust for God and how God brings people together. And it focuses more when you have restrictions on the external versus the internal in terms of what we really should be looking for in relationships is how our spirit and our inner man is.
Mm-hmm. You bet. That's definitely the core issue for us all. Thanks, Ben. Abortion. Let's touch on this just for a second. One of the most divisive and intractable. I mean, here we're talking about people that are made in the image of God, and we're just going to treat them like something we could just throw away. Even for Christians, I mean, there are pro-choice Christians. Maybe they're saying, I would never do it, but I want to give people freedom. All right, so they're not saying I'd go out and get abortions, but there are some that do. Extreme statements, abortion's murder, we're free to be moral agents. And I'm thinking of those that would speak from both ends. I had a quote here, and I'm going to read it because I don't have it with me, from Bonhoeffer. He was very strong against abortion. The early church was very strong against abortion. The Greco-Roman culture was very much an abortion culture. Many scholars feel that Bible scholars feel that the reason Jews did not, in part, not exclusively, but in part, a Jew did not want to go into the home of a Gentile, a Greco-Roman Gentile, a Hellenistic culture, because babies were flushed down the toilet. I mean, that's our human way of saying it. But the association with dead bodies, is what they were concerned about. That was an extreme statement, but yet that was represented there. What do we see in Scripture? Life's a gift. It's from God for all. Acts 17, Paul talking on Mars Hill, 25, verse 25 and 28 mentions that. All people bear God's image. Genesis 9, verse 6. When you take a life, you be careful how you deal with the blood. Remember that context. Life in the womb is real. It's not just a blob of cells. How do we know that biblically? Well, Psalm 139. What other places? Where else?
When Mary visited.
Yeah, Mary visits Elizabeth, and the fetuses conversed. They jumped, they knew each other. It's another place. Jeremiah 1, same thing. He was talking about his pre-birth time in the womb. All life must be valued. Exodus 21, 22 through 25. Now I'm all of a sudden forgetting what those verses say. Exodus 21, after the Decalogue. Oh, yes, this one. If a man struggle with each other and strike a woman with child, she's pregnant and she gives birth prematurely. So there's sacredness, there's life for life, tooth for tooth there in the law that they talked about. Mentioned the early church's position was very strong against the practice of exposing children, aborting children, and then all the arguments that we hear, and I'm not going to go through them, but this is where we have to have a clear biblical statement to be able to talk to people. Now, I don't know, Evangeline, what kind of counseling ministry, but I'm assuming you have counseled or will counsel women that go through crisis pregnancy is the term we give it, and so you have to have a loving, gracious, biblical response for people that have faced that and people that have done that. Had a pastor before me at one church I pastored, and I learned what his practice was, and he really tried to acknowledge people that had an abortion, and not to, and by acknowledge him, not to put them on show or anything, identify them publicly, but talking biblically and as the Spirit deals with their life and their heart, how to help them heal is what he was trying to do, and I really appreciate what he did. Leave it there. But maybe we could ask here on the other side, there's an issue that we usually don't bring up, the whole contraception question. Where is that life point? And because those are significant questions that as a pastor, you sometimes, when you do marital counseling, you're going to be talking about those issues. What are you going to do for family planning? In our culture, it means one thing. What would we mean and what would we say? And how would we say that all life's sacred? And even in the family planning, there are different methods of contraception that it's after the conception of the child. So you have to deal with those issues. Surrogacy is another issue. When my wife and I wanted to have children, we couldn't. We couldn't have any kids. Now we have 5 and we have a bunch of grandkids here now, so something changed. But there was a period in which we couldn't. We went to the doctor, took all the tests, and it was on my side. And so the doctor said to us, as my wife and I are sitting across the table, says, well, you could always have a sperm donor. My wife said, bye. So she walked out. I didn't even get what he was saying. I said, what did he say? What did he say? She walked out. So anyway, there are options that are there. And those are other biblical questions you have to think through. Here's where some Christians would step toward that because there's not physical intimacy with the person that the sperm is placed in or the egg. Is that adultery? Is that not adultery? As he centers around the question there somewhere. But that's another significant question about what is the value of the life. We're also talking about deformity. I went to a seminar for pastors once led by a doctor who is an ethicist, and he's a medical doctor, a physician, a surgeon, I think, in Chicago, and he had written a book. Orr is his last name, and I didn't bring it from the office there to bring it in here. And he talked about beginning of life and end of life ethical issues from a Christian perspective as a doctor. But here he was talking to all pastors, so it was written for us to think about it. And so there's a number of issues, number of situations where we have to help people think through. Again, if you're wanting to, this is an area of life that you'd want to for this paragraph, in your paper on anthropology, you just want to write that. I want to get down my statement on beginning life worldview, biblical worldview toward the beginning of life and the sacredness of life. Do so. The last one that I had here is the euthanasia assisted suicide question. What we're dealing with is a human dignity issue, autonomy, end of life suffering. There are a number of issues that are involved that people consider, the option. And you hear what's going on around the world as well as what's here in America. Basically, the world is leaning towards saying it's okay if it promotes the best interests of everyone concerned and it violates no one's rights. So we're talking about the issue of, is it appropriate for a Christian or a Christian to encourage others to take their lives and not allow a natural process to take their life? Unless Christ comes back, we're all going to die. And sometimes death is rather gruesome, painful, dehumanizing in what has to medically be done to you. You can imagine all the surgeries and all the prodding and whatnot that just make it difficult. Thinking through the different, there's an active euthanasia where you take your life as the patient. There's passive euthanasia where you allow someone else, physician assisted, or they remove life support. They're not trying to kill you with drugs or anything, but they speed along the process of dying and what goes on. Another question that enters in this euthanasia is, what is ordinary and what's extraordinary treatment? I had a gentleman in church, he and his wife, Hazel Hawk was her name, my second funeral I think I ever did for in the church in ministry. And she had died. She was in a nursing home, had dementia or Alzheimer's, or more than Alzheimer's, it's the dementia. She would escape. So she was very mobile. But she finally got to the point where they removed all the life support from her. So I sat with him when she passed, there, and that was a rather difficult thing. But the question is, we can keep a body alive with a lot of extraordinary measures. Should we keep a body alive? So we need to have a theology of death and dying. It's really what I'm arguing there. Voluntary, involuntary, non-voluntary, that's another issue that goes on. Here's just some points that we think from Scripture. Death is a part of our career, if you could use that term. To die will require a Christian, to die well, I missed my second word there, will require a Christian perspective. Why so? Well, because you're understanding life, you're understanding eschatology, and I'm talking about personal eschatology there. And I understand the grace of God and the purposes that God doesn't always heal. In fact, the vast majority of times, he lets natural processes take their root. Here, a third thing, the answer to fear, and that's what a lot of people talk about, we all talk about, is found in the hope of the gospel. Now, what does that mean? I say that, but then to say that to someone dying, who is saying, I'm suffering, I want to end it now. All right, what are the options that are being told? I'm hearing articles, reading articles, I'm hearing the news that of just a couple anecdotal things. People in Canada, evidently they're really changing in this area. The people have been encouraged, older people, they come in, they aren't dying necessarily, they're just sick and elderly. It says, well, have you considered euthanasia? Basically. So the world's passing out some. That doctor that I mentioned, Dr. Orr, as well as this other resource that I got these notes from, the answer is good palliative care. And this is just a practical thing. There are so many good things to care for a person in that dying process to ease their pain. Now, there's a trade-off too, but is the answer, well, let's just go ahead and kill them? See, I say that, and it sounds real crass, but that's the decision that you're facing there. And then number 5, answer to the indignity of dying is compassion. And that's where the Christian church in history, we started the hospitals. You know, we were the ones that pushed back on the Roman Empire to get rid of abortion. We did. One of the churches that I pastored, it was before me with another pastor, was very, in the denomination, there was a very anti-life in the area of abortion element. And this church, he was instrumental in leading this church to lead the denomination to come out with a strong statement concerning abortion. I mean, to be pro-life. So there are some things that we can do that address the indignity of dying and express our compassion. And inverted dignity, meaning we flip it around. I mean, there are some indignities with the dying process that we can come in and help people think through, because we have a worldview that sees them created in the image of God and of value at from the moment of conception to the moment of last breath. And even the care for the body. You know, that has been a significant thing of a Christian thing. Question, comment, anybody on this area? All right, my encouragement is, as you're writing this paper on anthropology, you come to this section, as well as the one later with Damon, pick one, or maybe you want to make a statement that summarizes, you know, how we need to talk to our culture that is perverting the image of God, that we're just an animal. And what can we say to them? Well, let's take a 5-minute break. Take a stretch. Evangeline, you'll come in and do it.
It's not warm in here.
In the assembly of righteousness. There's a debate about what is this TH610. This is true. It means to go take up the didn't stand. That was a mod back in verse 1. Now we have cities to stand position. Rise up. And so
How you been?
Yeah, doing good. How are you?
Good.
All right.
all right, it's 76 in that room. I don't know what it is in here.
Warm. Not butter hot, but warm.
Yep. It's coming.
It's really interesting for me that the American society have a tension between abortion, around abortion, the pro-life and pro-choice. Yeah.
Because
in my country, people don't talk about abortion. Well, it's legal, absolutely legal in Japan to abort a baby. And people don't want to talk about it because if someone talk about it, we have to, think about, life and abortion, the dignity of humanity. People not like to think about that because they need an answer to that, right? So
Yeah, right, right. If you got into try to initiate a conversation with somebody,
I haven't heard of
Whether you- you
that
haven't?
kind of conversation.
Oh.
Yeah.
so the pastors don't preach on it because it's not an issue, or
I haven't heard about abortion, the topic on abortion in the chapel, but yeah, the Christian understand the abortion is not good, but
So you say it's legal. How many happen a year?
I'm not sure, but I think it is happening. I mean, it's not a small number.
The first Google
Yeah.
results is in 2022, approximately 123,000 in Japan,
Oh wow.
which was a very
123,000 abortions
induced abortions,
induced. Okay.
whatever that means.
So in medical terms too, if a woman miscarry a baby, I miscarried 2 babies on my own. But the medical term of miscarrying a baby, they call it abortion nowadays too.
Yeah. It's spontaneous, isn't it? Is that the term we use? Something like that. Yeah.
Mhm.
The body just did a natural process, unfortunately. In Japan, we hear in the news the different demographics. Meaning, do we have enough children to replace the population? And in particular, Japan is below replacement level. Now, we are too in America. There are very few countries here in the West and the North.
Yeah,
Is
so
that
very
part
low.
of it?
Yeah.
Or do people just not marry? Or they just don't
I
value
think
children?
it's both. Yeah, people get to the marriage rate is decreasing, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they think we don't need husband, wife, and children because I'm okay without the wife and children. I'm happy
Is
right
sexual
now, so-
promiscuity just accepted?
Yeah. So the concept of family is how should I put this? Yeah. The younger people think about the family as not the happiness to pursue, or it's not something that I should have or anything, but just younger generation think that family is something burden kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the marriage rate is declining, and that's the low birth rate.
Mhm.
Yeah. So government wants people to marry and have children.
Yeah, I heard it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the government
Didn't they start paying people to have
Yeah,
children?
they do. The
That's
government,
what I thought I heard.
government support to pay money per child.
It's interesting. Francine, we're Evangeline. I keep saying Francine because I had a student that's Francine. I am so sorry. I can't get out.
No, you're fine.
No, I'm not fine. I got to get it right. But anyway, we're introducing your topic is what I'm thinking of, but I need to not steal your thunder here. When I went to Uganda the first time, and I met the students there from 5 different African countries around there, missionaries, pastors, and I asked them to get up and introduce themselves, and they'd stand up, and 5, 6 of the guys, and of maybe 20, that introduced themselves, they'd say, "Hi, I'm David, and I'm married. I'm the husband of one wife." Oh, okay, that's cool. You're married. You're type thing. But all of them said that 5 of them out of the group that got up and talked, husband of one wife. So tell me what's going on here. Well, we're a polygamous culture. In fact, the gentleman who was running the Word of Life compound where we met, we had a school that we used their facility. We weren't Word of Life; it was another school. And he just riding back to the airport, I said, Thomas, tell me a little bit, Thomas Obundi, tell me a little bit about your life. He says, well, my dad had 3 wives. I didn't know Dad very well, so we had an interesting conversation. So what would he And I'm now thinking of those men there. I wasn't teaching a theology class. I was teaching ministry studies and preaching. But they want to have a clear statement, on that one too.
I've heard of missionaries where they went and planted churches, and it was an entire generation before the church could have a pastor or deacon, because
Yeah.
all the men that they went and evangelized, they came to Christ, but it was very clear they couldn't, the scriptural answer wasn't to divorce two of your wives to be a pastor. So
Yeah.
it was, well, I guess your kids are gonna have to make pastors for themselves.
Oh, cool. All right. Introduce the topic here: male and female and marriage. There, get us going, Evangeline.
So my topic tonight it's male and female complementary.
Uh-huh.
I tried to find the right definition, but it always comes back to complementary means mutual, combine, and collective, and in a relationship or situation in which two or more different things improve or emphasize each other's qualities. We're talking about male and female here. The complementarism of male and female means that God has created men and women equal in their essential and human personhood. However, they're different and complementary in their function or role in home and in church. In Genesis 1:26, we all know this, that God created male and female. In Genesis 2:18, it says it is not good that a man should be alone, and God decided to make Adam a helper, and that is Eve. But Adam and Eve were created in God's image and equal before God as persons and distinct in their manhood and womanhood. So there's distinction there. Complementarism believes that the gender roles found in the Bible are purposeful and meaningful distinctions. When applied in the home and church, they promote spiritual health for both men and women. And it's kind of funny that I have this topic actually, because my church last Sunday our pastor talks about husband and wife, and how he talks about Ephesians 5:21 and 22:23, submitting to one another out of the reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your own husband as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the church, his body, and his himself to its savior. And I don't know, I just felt like my qualities is not really like submission. To me, it's very hard to accomplish. So that's why I find it really funny to have this topic, and I don't know why I chose this topic. um husband as the head of husband as the head in home and spiritual welfare of the family should be loving, humble, and sacrificial, as what the Bible says. Wife should be nurturing the children intentionally and willingly. Um, First Timothy 2:11 says, if I can find it, let the woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. And that's the role in the church for a woman. And I think I asked one professor way back in my bachelor's at Calvary about this. It just doesn't sit well with me. And he gracefully explained this to me, and so I take it really, I understood, but still trying to understand it. Men bear the responsibility to provide spiritual leadership and training in the household, and I I agree with that actually. Having a husband who is spiritually mature in our house right now, it's very important for me and to my children, and seeing how he really lead our family to Christ every single time. I did not grow up having a good father spiritually, or like just being in a relationship with my biological father. It was really hard growing up. So seeing how my husband lead my family to God and having that good leadership in our home is very important to my children. And so seeing that affect my daughter's life as well in a good way is very good. Women exercise spiritual gifts in a way that allows the scripture. I asked so many, not so many, but I asked a few professors at Calvary about this because I always have a hard time understanding why a woman cannot preach and just the specific roles in the church. I grew up in Assemblies of God in the Philippines, and so I have a woman pastor who can preach. And so when I moved here, there's that similarity, but really different. And so again, I'm not a feminist, but it's still, I'm having a hard time understanding it, but reading through the Bible and really understanding the concept of how God created men and women and really understanding my role in the ministry and in my family really helps me accepting that my husband has a specific role and I have a specific role in my family and in our church. And I did I think in our today's generation, this concept of letting the men lead in the household and even in a church, if you're a Christian, like young women in today's generation, whether they're Christian or not, still trying to understand the concept of the role why men should lead. Um, every Not every time, but like specific rules in church and in the household. And so and again, it always goes back to Galatians 3:28. I think Dr. Dodds read that earlier about either you're Greek or Gentile, man, male or female, that kind of thing. That's I think that was the verse that I was using when I asked this specific question to one professor at Calvary. Like, this is the specific verse that I was reading. So why women cannot preach in church? Because I always have that issue in my head for some reason. Because again, coming from a church in the Philippines, who my pastor is a woman can preach, and then when I moved here, my church doesn't allow it, and so it was just like trying to understand that. Men and women's role in church are I can't say the word, are interchangeable in church leadership and household. I think that's one of the issue or the problem, aside from the young woman who's trying to understand the different roles of men and women in church and in the household. I think this is another issue that I guess our new generation trying to understand. I don't even know how to phrase that in a different way, but yeah, just I guess I guess I honestly did not understand the concept before, and I'm glad I asked the question to people, you know, in Calvary and people in my church about this different concept of accepting the different rules in the ministry or in the household between the men and the women. And I'm glad I asked that question because it kind of opened up to me to different verses and also like really understanding that, yes, I have a different qualities that I can bring in the ministry that the man can't, and the man can bring something in the ministry that the woman can't. And so really admitting and understanding that fact too. But I guess to end this, sorry, this is just a short presentation because I could go on and on about this, but I think I don't know why I picked a topic because when I read this today, I had a hard time actually. I'm like, why did I pick this topic? Um, so I guess my question, since I'm the only woman in this class, I guess I have one question for you guys. As men, how do you explain this biblical truth about the different roles of men and women, specifically in today's generation?
Hey, good question. Anyway, is that, I didn't cut you off. Go ahead.
I think that's it. I think
That's
I
it.
stopped there
All right.
because again, I know I'm mature spiritually, but I think because I think it's me, it's just my personality. I do not like the word submission in general. Like when I read that part in Ephesians, I'm like, I just irk it. But again, coming from a different culture also in the Philippines and just moving here, again, different culture, and we're talking about ethnicity, culture today, I mean tonight. Um, I have a whole lot about it, but again, I refuse not. I just didn't want to say anything because sometimes it doesn't sit well with me. But I guess that's my question to you guys. As men, how do you explain this biblical truth about the different roles of men and women, specifically in today's generation? Because this is sometimes a hot topic.
Yes.
And I want to hear either some of you guys because I think it would also help me to really like understand.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Your question leads to this area. As you come to this area in your doctoral statement, you could either write a statement because it's important to you how to talk about just male-female relationships or roles, or if there's a way that you know that you need to, like what you were just saying is we need to answer a question. If that's what you need to do, write that in this paragraph. If you need to talk about marriage and how it applies, then you could approach the topic from that angle and just talk about the relationships of men and women in marriage, husband and wife specifically. We talk about. I got a couple questions for you. You said you're hearing that young women are hearing that men and women are interchangeable. Is that really true? How do you hear that?
So I guess that's one of the issue that I encounter most times from women in my age. Like they don't understand, or younger than me, I should not say that, younger than me, that the role of men and women in church should be equal. It should not be women cannot preach. It should not be, because I felt like even though some of my friends, they're mature Christians, they're younger than me or around my age, but still trying to understand that concept. I guess because how this generation really gravitates towards women empowerment
Mm-hmm.
and all that. So like we can do all these things and la la la, but then trying to see that there is a difference between men and women. I mean, obviously there is a big difference, but I think when it comes to rule, I think the biggest thing for the people in my generation is this role in the church. For some reason, it's such again, a big deal. But yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know if that answered your question.
that's fine. It is. Because you wonder what's influencing people, and you don't want to make any assumptions. But okay, I always want to hear that. Another question, and maybe you'd rather not answer it. You kept struggling with the word submission. Is there? Because I've heard that in other places. It isn't just you, for sure. Why is that a hard word? Say it a little bit more, could you? Because submission says, and is that something that's coming from the culture? Something coming from, I don't know what. Why is submission a word?
Yes, I think yeah, maybe it's a culture too. I grew up in a culture where I've seen again, I didn't have a really good relationship with my dad, and my mom, she was not submissive at all. So it was kind of like that's how I grew up. And so becoming an adult, becoming, like this person who I am, when the word submission, and I know that surrendering to Christ, I have to do that, and that submission too and all that. But for some reason, it just kind of irked me. Like, it just doesn't sit well with me personally, but it's like a work in progress. I'm like, hey, I'm a work in progress. This is something that I need to work on every day and daily. I'm not gonna lie. And so, I don't know, it's culture or my upbringing, maybe upbringing, honestly, and trying to teach my girls that it's okay to be submissive and, I don't know, it's just, yeah. I don't know why I picked this topic, to be honest. I was just like laughing at myself today because I'm like, of all the topics that you picked this topic.
When you deal with the word submission, you're focusing on the who is submitting.
Yes,
Who are you
that's my
submitting?
problem.
Well, not anytime you deal with submission, there's a clear role environment involved. The people that are submitting, who are they submitting to?
It's true.
Let me put another context on it. I've got a daughter who's married to a Christian man, and he seems to portray at times that he has to demand that she submit. My
Mm.
wife, my daughter, and we're looking at it. Okay, they have a decent relationship, but egalitarianism sounds attractive to her because he throws out the word complementarian in the Bible verses at her. You're a woman, you got to submit. Well, I come back, I look at the verses, and it's Jesus saying the wife should submit. It's not the husband.
Mhm.
Submission is something you give, just like love is something the man should give by Ephesians 5. When Paul in verses 21 says, submit one to another, I think that verse is a good beginning because I'm to submit to my wife in a way that really rings her bell, if you want to use an image.
Yeah.
Really communicates love to her. Now, it says love for the man, but what does it mean to love? That means to sacrificially serve her, because that's what the text is. For a woman, what is it for a woman needs to put herself under the needs of a man? Well, when a loving wife respects, because that's another word in the text, and then follows his leadership. I'm not going to use the word submit here. Wow, because why? Now you're ministering to his felt love language, if we could use that in counseling terms.
Mhm.
That's part of it. Interesting. I just got off the wire today as I was waiting before the class, looking in the news. The Southern Baptists are grappling with women in the pulpit. So they're another denomination that's had some questions over the years, and now it's still being pushed. We need to let our women, because there are some Southern Baptist churches that allow women to preach, but the vast majority, and now they're disfellowshipping some of those churches because they're needing to make a stand one way or the other.
Moore, she was Southern Baptist, and then she
Beth Moore, yeah, she changed.
A lot of them followed her, didn't they?
Yeah, that's part of it. Let me ask a couple questions. Why do we have two genders by creation? Backing up, Genesis 1. Why do you think? Why did God need to mention that? We've already talked about it briefly, but now we're going to put it in this context of, all right, there's two different beings that God said, I want to make my image in them. And I think I mentioned when we talked about it last week that the terms are definitely sexual terms. I mean, it's obvious he's talking about sex, gender. I mean, the sexual identity. Thought, anybody? Part of it might be because they're going to procreate. So they are sexual beings. So it couldn't be. I had a chaplain friend. He said God didn't create Adam and Steve. He created Adam and Eve. He jokingly talked about that because they can have babies. All right, that might be part of it, but I think it goes a little bit beyond. As you were talking, Evangeline, just the relational dynamic, the fact that the author Moses uses, "Let us make man in our image." There is this relationship within the Godhead that's mirrored in the relationships in humanity. It makes a lot of theological sense to me, though I don't think we can say Trinity, but it sure allows for it here. And then that progeny. So there's even a Trinity image there. All right, next question would be, then how is chapter 2 different? Chapter 1, Evangeline, you said it's obvious. These are two equal ontological beings. They have the same value in God's eyes. They're male and female, but they stand together and they're necessary. It's not like, well, the little woman comes along, no, she and he both are necessary. Now we're in a culture that says men are no longer necessary. Now we can go down that road, but I don't want to go down there because that's not our purpose. But yet that's the context in which we're thinking that, why chapter 2 different? Man's created first, placed in the garden, given the command. We don't know when the woman heard the command. And then the wording in verse 18, then the Lord said to God said to him, this is Genesis 2, it's not good for the man to be alone. Now, we tend to think, yeah, that's right. It's not a relational thing that he's missing in the sense of, well, I need a woman. I mean, he could have related to a dog, most guys that like their dog type thing. But there's more going on to it. He's not complete. I'd like to say it that way, because he says, I will make him a helper suitable. Helper? All right, God's called her helper. People refer that. But yes, that she's to come along and complement, you use that word, complementarianism as opposed to egalitarianism. But the word suitable, rather interesting term. Here's Adam. He's seen all the animals as they're brought by. Still couldn't find one suitable for him. It says later in the text, same word. And the word almost, it's graphic. It implies see an eye to eye. And out here in the margin, it says corresponding to in the New American Standard. Like him, yes, that's part of it. She's not another animal. But yet that imagery, he's looking at her eyeball to eyeball. You're like me, but not totally like me. I mean, I can relate to you. We're on the same plane. So there's an equality of personhood, but there's more involved. One who corresponds to him, but not exactly like him. Now, it's interesting you use the phrase, we asked about why they're different. Where else did you talk about it? Interchangeable parts. That was an interesting phrase you used there, because that's not what's being described. They're not interchangeable parts. Why do we need two different people? And so we look at this, we look throughout Scripture how men are described, how women are described. And just in this chapter alone, what's going on with the man? Well, man was placed in the garden, given a responsibility to cultivate the garden. And then the woman's brought alongside as a helper. The wording used, and I think you said it as well, men initiate, move into the world to build culture. Well, I read one person describing it, and that makes a lot of sense to me. We're builders. We want to make things. All right, don't take that image too far. But when it comes to what we're supposed to do in the culture, we're supposed to build this culture for the Lord. And the woman nurtures culture. All the terminologies is used throughout Scripture to describe femininity in women. There's more of a relational, nurturing bent. There in 1 Timothy 2, where Paul says, women will be saved through childbearing. What is he talking? I think he's referring back here. There's something in our natures. All right, we use the term roles, and I need to let you all talk too, because that's what you asked us all to talk here. Is role an appropriate term when we think of how we're made? We're made equally, uniquely. Is that just a role that I fulfill? So what would be a different word that I could use than a role? Because a role means, all right, you balance the checkbook this week and I'll balance it next week. That's just a role function. You're taking out the garbage because guys have to take out the garbage. No, I can take out the garbage too. I mean, that's just a role function. You're that person. In some homes where the woman's the breadwinner, she earns more money, he stays home and watches the kids. All right, we could talk anecdotally. Does that work out? Well, couples do make it work out. I had a good couple friend where the wife was the nurse. She's well paid. She was a dietitian. Joe Funk had almost totally blind. Yes, he wrote things, but he had to look at his computer screen an inch away, and he was going blind. So they had a reversed life. He couldn't drive. Yeah, they had some kids, but he was very much a man's man type thing in many respects. But they had roles reversed. Is masculinity and femininity just a role? No. So what else is it? Josh, you say something?
I was just parsing on my own head. I'm still not there yet. This idea, a lot of times when you hear people argue that men and women must be equal, God created man and woman equally as far as like they're both equally in his image. He didn't create them to be identical.
Mm-hmm.
So are there things that men and women can both do? I mean, yes, I got in my car and drove here. I assume ladies get in their car and drive places, and I won't make a stupid joke about how ladies can call your ass
Don't do it.
because not the time or the place. But
sexist comments here.
Absolutely. There's a million ways to get in trouble here. But there's things where, although it's funny, we always make jokes about how women are bad drivers, but the insurance companies charge guys more because they crash more. So it's kind of funny. So this idea that are there things that God created men and women for? Yes. Are there responsibilities he gives to one and not the other? I would say yes. I mean, I don't think I'm ever going to bear a child in the sense of like it's going to grow in my stomach, because that's not how this works.
Well, let me push on that one there. Does a child do two different kinds of children? I've got a boy, I got a girl. Perfect family, is what we think of. All right, but you have boys and you have girls. Why do each of those kids, males and females, need both kinds of parents?
I wasn't saying they don't need both kinds of parents. I was saying that like God created women to bear children in a way that men don't.
I know.
Okay.
Take it the next step though.
Okay.
Why would they need both kinds of parents beyond just she can have a baby and I can't? She can nurse it and I can't. Yeah.
Insofar as both, like I said, there's things that both boys and girls can do. Having parents teach them both how to do things is important. Also gives them a model for, a good family, gives them a model where, I mean, I don't have a million studies in my back pocket, but generally speaking, kids that grew up in healthy homes go on to do better in adult life in healthy homes.
Why?
Because they saw they saw how their parents interacted, and they saw not just the women submitting, but they saw the husband loving right back, and they saw the mutual love.
Yeah.
But then you have a single mom that would tell you that this young boy, young girl grew up in a home where she's, being the mother and a father, and turns out to be an amazing person.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you explain that? Because that is something that a lot of single mom would say, I do not need a man to raise my children with me, because I can raise this, beautiful person to be an amazing person someday. I mean, that is something that a lot of young moms that I talk about, especially when they're in a bad relationship. And so how would you rather have two parents in a home and fight all the time? I mean, we're talking about Christian family here. We're not talking about non-believer here. I mean, we're living in a world and it's a fallen world, and so we're all sinners. And so this specific family, both the mom and dad fights all the time. And so the woman came up to me, asked for my help, and she asked me this question: would I rather live with this guy him and I always fight and the kids see it all day, than me raising my children and have a harmonious life?
What Josh mentioned is not an answer, but it's part of the thing you got to factor in. Study after study demonstrates a two-parent home, even if they're fighting, does better for the kids. All right, so that's the statistic. I'll be the one that'll beat it. Okay, maybe. And there are a lot of good people, fathers and mothers that are,
Yeah, I mean,
deal with the load, and they've got responsibilities. So what can we as a church do? Right now, we got a different class going on here, ministry studies, but that's a tough one.
Mhm.
You'd want to say to the Christian parents, you need to start working together, for your marriage, because the statistics on marriage, those that work it out are doing a lot better than those that get
Yeah.
divorced and
Even then,
separate.
from the
So
kid's perspective, if they
again, that
see-
doesn't help somebody in the pain of it. I totally understand that. Go ahead,
Oh
Joe.
yeah, it definitely doesn't help with the pain, but like again, you said Christian home, unchristian home. There's times where you might have to counsel a lady to leave if the guy's like being literally abusive. But assuming Christian home, again, not going way off in the weeds of how we could take this case study. The kid, no matter who you eventually get around to marrying, if I ever got that far, which I'm told you're not going to see eye to eye on everything all the time. Kids don't see eye to eye with everybody on everything all the time either. So if they see how mom and dad actually like take real problems and they deal with real problems, not screaming and yelling, but they actually like talk through and stuff, that right there is actually a part of the model. I think, of the top of the studies of how these kids going to be better. It's not just that they don't see problems, it's that they actually see how you deal with a problem.
Yeah, and we have a culture. I think you said it too, Ben. I hear you.
And not only that, it's also in terms of there's a lot that can be said about this particular topic, but also in a Christian home where both parents are together, it's more feasible in terms of being able to learn how to react to the different gender, male and female. And a lot of times when you have children that, and I'm not saying it's it's foolproof, but a lot of times when you have let's say a father absent from the home, the children have a hard time knowing how to interact with someone that is in charge, a male teacher, a male, whatever, a male supervisor. And so, those are some reasons why, the two parent household, other than the obvious, are needed, so to speak. It can work with one parent, but ideally, when a child is able to see two parents interact, and the children are able to interact with their parents as father and mother, then they get practice in terms of dealing with male and female and those that have rule over them as well.
Yeah, we have a couple in the church. The husband no longer comes to church. He had been one of our leaders. It was a really sad thing. He's walked away. They're probably going to get divorced. Their son, they're trying to adopt this boy, and he's 11, 12. He's really getting out of control. He's starting to hit her, the mom. This last Sunday, and I'm just thinking of the church, we men cannot be the substitute dad for him in one sense. He's got his dad. His dad was a druggie, and so that's why they were trying to adopt him, and he doesn't even have a relationship, I think, with his natural dad. But he's at an age where he needs a role model, a male role model.
In children's ministry, we see this all.
And so this last Sunday, our drummer, who's related to him distantly, to Max, the little boy, saw him acting up, treating his mom disrespectfully during church. And so he finishes the song, comes off the platform, says, "Max, out now." And they go out and have a conversation. Mm-hmm. Those of us that know, well, good. I went up to Dave afterwards and said, "Hang in there. I know you can't be dad, but you sure can." That kind of conversation. So, there's where the body of Christ comes in. Let me ask a question. I'm going to steal the thunder here a little bit and see what other questions we have. You mentioned, Evangeline, that the Bible tells how we relate in the home and the church. Do we not relate that way in the world as men and women?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I got to be careful with what I'm saying here. That doesn't mean that a woman submits to ungodly men. Okay, sometimes you have an ungodly husband or an ungodly father, or I don't
Yeah.
mean that either. But yet, if my masculinity, if your femininity is not just a role I fill, but it's a, I like the word bent. I heard another person, a Christian counselor, say it's the bent I have. I have a masculine bent. Now I've got to be nurtured in how to do that, but I sort of naturally do things as a guy. I'm a risk taker. I take initiative sometimes.
Mhm.
I can wimp out and be sinful and not take initiative and not be responsible. And my wife gets all over my back when I don't, you know. But that there is something inside us that compels us to act, and that we as a church can nurture, and then we're going to express wherever we are. So women being respectful to men and men lovingly, careful with the word leading other women, but that's the context.
Anytime you brought it out beyond marriage, you have to be careful. Apparently, I'm told throughout history, people went and said women submit to men, therefore all women submit to all men.
Yeah.
In the text, it's very clear. I'm looking at Titus 2 right now that women submit to their own husbands.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not this idea that all men get to tell all women what to do. That's cultures have gone there. That's not biblical at all. Again, do
Depends
men
on
and
what you're
women
talking
have?
about, I'd say.
But do men and women have certain, like you said, bents or strengths? I would say yeah. And even like in it's your normal job or like workplace. There's things that the guys are good at, and then there's things that we look at and go, okay, the ladies go, okay, now your turn because we have no idea how to do this part. So working together as a team, using different people's strengths, where there's like a interplay here where I know what I'm good at and I know what she's good at, and so if I do my thing and then hand it off to her to make it look pretty or whatever, then it turns out better. There's a certain sense where there can be a teamwork here. It doesn't have to be all men are bossing around all ladies or anything dumb like that.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that it was a couple of things I wanted to say. I kind of see what Evangeline was saying as far as women being kind of discouraged biblically in terms of being on the pulpit or preaching because given committing my life, recommitting my life back to Christ at a later age, and growing up, or rather being in a city where the most of the churches are African American. There are many churches that I've been to where women are preachers, and they're assistant pastors, and I've heard they're missionaries, so they preach, and so I struggle with that as well in terms of not condemning it or anything like that, but I'm almost on the male side seeing the same, having the same perspectives as Evangeline, as far as like it just doesn't add up to me in terms of
Yeah.
women not being able to preach, and but because I've been at several churches and was formerly at a church where this assistant pastor was a woman. That was one comment, but I also wanted to comment in terms of Dr. Dodds, when you said that word roles, and it's kind of hard to deviate from that because I believe that I just think it's interesting how God said he spoke it and said that we are created in His image, and He said let us, and so just like the triune God, He they're equal in nature, but they have different functions or roles, so to speak. And so they're equal in essence and nature. But I just find it interesting how God purposely let Adam relate to the animals first, and I believe He was trying to see, help Adam to see that one, he was alone, but that two, he can't do it by himself in terms of subduing the earth. So I think he had to create that in he like I believe you said men tend to initiate and then women nurture. But I believe that God, I just find it fascinating how God, he could have just created man and then woman at the same time, or before Adam related, but he purposely let Adam see that he was alone and he needed companions and he needed that complement feature to help him in terms of what God had ordained him to do.
Yeah. Interesting footnote, observational from just life. Who usually remarries quickly after the death of a spouse, the man or the woman?
Usually, remarriage is more likely to be men, although there's typically less widowers than widows.
Yeah, well, that's true, number-wise. But men tend to remarry within a year. Women could last a lot longer before they remarry if they do at all. That's just a general. Turn to 1 Corinthians 7. Here's another verse I want to talk about just to see the differences. We're talking about Genesis and Ephesians. And now Paul makes an interesting comment. We're talking about the image of God here. The context is verse 3 starts it. I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man. The man is the head of a woman. And God is the head of Christ. So there's some subordination going on in the Godhead and in relationships that we've been talking about. He then talks about the hair covering and wow, a bunch of diversity of opinion, what that means. But verse 7, for a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. And then he goes on, and so I don't want to slight the passage. Why would Paul say that? All right, maybe we could say, and I'm going to just look at the clock here, and I'm keeping you all from thinking on it. And maybe you thought through this passage, you want to say, wait, I want to say something. That Adam, mankind, it's named after Adam. Is there another word he could have used? Dirt is really what Adam is. The priority of man, you mentioned 1 Timothy. There's a priority going there. I want men to lift up holy hands in prayer. I want women to learn in submissiveness. Why? Because man was created first, he says there in 1 Timothy 2. What's with the priority of man and why? What have you ever thought of this verse? Anybody? 1 Corinthians 11, verse 7. Why is man listed as the image of God and woman the image of man? Now, there's a lot going on in that church, too, that we need to think about. Anybody ever have a thought on that one?
What was the question again? Why is
Paul talking about the image, that somehow the image of God is in man, but it's the image of man in a woman? But the woman is the glory of man. All right, so glory is involved in it, part of it, the image and glory of God. Thoughts, anyone? Masashi, want to take a stab?
Yeah, but obviously, Paul is talking about his focus is on glory,
Right.
not it.
That is prominent.
And then he does not say that woman doesn't represent the image of God.
Right.
So,
That's another good observation too. It's not that somehow she's lesser.
Yeah.
In one sense.
Paul even goes around the circle that woman was created second, but now man is born of woman. So he brings the circle around there too in later verses.
Mm-hmm. There's a little book I have in my library. I picked up it a few years ago. Wayne Grudem has written a lot of books on the masculine, feminine issues, and he was in the battle. One of the guys that wrote with John Piper a big book on complementarianism. And the title of the book is Evangelical Feminism, ? The New Route to Liberalism. All right, so he tracks through there not only the different viewpoints of different passages, but his last chapter, I don't remember the specific title, but basically it's the elimination of all things masculine. That's where he's projecting the culture going. And I think what Paul is saying in a sense is in this glory and what you're doing in this church, and it seems like Corinth had some problems in the male-female relationship issues there, is what he's trying to address here. And when we establish and now we got to be careful, you mentioned Evangeline, the submission word, and who does it and how do we do it and respect and all those things. But God put in place a priority not to be won over, but here's what my wife says. We've talked about this verse has a lot. She says, the woman is necessary to complete the image, but the man better be taking initiative. So the onus is sort of back on the man and for men to step up in the culture, um, wherever they're at, to properly image God, but he can't do it completely. So she needs to fulfill that glory there. So it's not a put down at all on women. And Paul goes on and says that in the next few verses there. We're not independent of each other. In fact, man comes out of woman, So there's that, necessary. But for as the woman originates from man, I'm reading verse 12. So also the man has his birth. We translate that there, interject that it's not in the text, through the woman, and all things originate from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman? And now he's talking in church. There are things that we do that model to the world in the church, in the home, in marriage, and how we relate. So it's an important issue for us. Somebody else, a comment about that, or maybe anything else?
I feel like
Yes.
I'm thankful for men in this class, because like we need, I think the world needs you guys to show women, young women, like in our generation specifically, that there are guys like you guys who can lead us in a way that God wanted us to be led. Because, there are some Christian men out there that pretend to be a Christian, but then doesn't follow what the word says. And so just comment on you guys for being here and knowing you guys through this class. I'm thankful for people like you guys who hopefully one day, I know we have single guys here, um, model your wife to Christ. And so I don't know, just a thought for you guys too.
And thank you.
Really, yeah.
Thank you too for the encouragement. All right. Anybody else comment?
Yeah, just in terms of that word submission, I think about how Jesus, he was equally God, but he still submitted to the Father and said, "Not, not my will, but thy will be done." But he still was God, and so maybe that might help Evangeline in terms of that word submission.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always look up to that one, and even my husband, if Christ can submit to the Father, you can submit. That word submission, you need to get it over with. And again, I'm a work in progress. I'm not going to deny that.
But in reaction to what you just said, in response to what you just said, I just appreciate your transparency in terms of just saying that you have an issue, and then when we confess, that's when we can pray for one another. That's what the Bible says, and then you can overcome whatever it is that's with that word. So I appreciate your transparency and your presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
I've had a couple women through the years of pastoral ministry come to me and say, I wish my husband would lead me spiritually. And your heart goes out when you hear that, not knowing what's going on in the home, but it could be a number of different things. It's true. You do that. All right, let's take a 5-minute break. Come back. Damon will introduce our last topic. Again, how the image is being perverted. Taking on in the marriage here. Is it comfortable in here, guys, to you? It feels like the air conditioner came on.
Better. I can feel the air conditioner cooling it down. It's cool. It's nice.
It's still on.
I guess I'm ready for it because it's already game. Got through the whole book already?
Yeah.
It's been through the whole book in our 5-minute break. Absolutely.
All right, we're all back. Why don't we start with Damon and let him get us kicked off with this video. Let me know, everybody online, if you don't. Wrong one. If you can't hear him or see him,
Hello, I am introducing the topics of adultery, homosexuality, and transgenderism tonight. And I'll start off with just a few simple definitions, a definition of each of them, and then I'll go into the verse that would best speak to these issues. and go on from there. All right, so adultery. There are two basic kinds of adultery that we read about in the Bible, either marital unfaithfulness or spiritual idolatry. And as this is about anthropology, obviously, we need to discuss the idea of marital unfaithfulness in terms of what adultery is. Adultery is defined in the Bible with reference to a woman's marital status, not a man's. So if a man has sex with another man's wife or another man's fiance, they are both committing adultery in that instance. And this is explicitly forbidden by the law of Moses in the seventh commandment. Homosexuality is engaging in sexual relations with a person of the same sex. And this is another sexual activity that is forbidden in the law, not the Ten Commandments, but we read in specifically Leviticus chapter 18. And then we also find in Leviticus chapters 18 and 20 that homosexuality is actually characterized as an abomination 5 separate times. Jesus himself cites God's established pattern of sexuality as what should be the normative pattern for everybody. And Paul also echoes Jesus' reliance on God's creative intention in his primary texts on homosexuality in Romans and Corinthians. And then transgenderism, our third term for our topic this evening, is simply claiming as an identity a gender that is different from biological sex. And this is where we have seen our culture split those terms, gender and sex, into two differently defined terms. And in terms of the Bible and what we find in biblical truth, there's not even a hint in Scripture that gender and sex are two different aspects of mankind, of humans, nor are they things that can be chosen or even changed by the individual. And we need to go back to God's creative account to understand this. So this topic with these three terms, adultery, homosexuality, and transgenderism, really starts with our discussion of dichotomy and trichotomy that we had last week. And that was such a good discussion because it has to do with the body, the fact that male and female bodies were created on the sixth day of creation. And these bodies were blessed by God, and the people with these bodies were commanded to be fruitful and multiply. We read that woman was made specifically for man to be a helper for the fulfillment of God's decree for mankind. And the institution of marriage was created for this to happen. In Genesis 2:24, we read, "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." So we read here that God is providing a very simple solution for the fulfillment of his purposes, his decree. And this is God's perfect intention for mankind. And we start with this intention. And so everything that happens from this point forward must be considered in view of this intention. And the verse says that I chose for our topic tonight that I think speak to each of these specific characterizations of the body in terms of how we use our body is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 12 through 20. I'll read those. I'm using the ESV version for this. We read this: all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be enslaved by anything. Food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both, one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For, as it is written, the two will become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. What a powerful passage, but that last phrase, so glorify God in your body, speaks to all three issues that we have in this topic tonight. These topics have obviously become extremely divisive in the American church in the last 30 years especially. And proponents of the acceptance of these things as normative practice for Christians today are having to twist and recontextualize biblical command and definition, as well as rejecting thousands of years of Christian thought and practice in order to basically align with the path that popular culture here in America is taking, or should I say the West in general is taking. And to be maybe oversimplistic, God loves his creation and wants people to live lives of love with each other, is what they are advancing in terms of why these things are okay. And this to them means that you should be able to express your love through sexuality, that you should be able to have sex with whomever you want, and to be able to identify however you desire in order to feel loved and to express love with those, especially who identify similarly. Obviously, this is really all about the self. And I think of reading through the book of Judges and how often you came across that phrase. Everyone just did what they wanted to do. Everyone did what they themselves determined what was right, instead of aligning themselves with the word of God and being able to know from that word what was right and what was wrong. So a question for tonight with regard to these three. I forgot to mention something in my notes, but I guess that's okay. Based on the weight of biblical evidence that oppose these practices, what does it truly mean to love God with all of your heart, soul, and body, as well as to love others as yourself? What does that truly mean in light of the biblical evidence that opposes these three things: adultery, homosexuality, and transgenderism? And I guess in regards to that, I'll just read the note that I forgot, because I think this is an important thought to have regarding the institution of God's intention for mankind through marriage in the expression of sexuality, with each other being limited to man and wife, husband and wife. And that's the fact that the creation account establishes maleness and femaleness in how sexuality was intended to be experienced as husband and wife. So how does that question then fit in with how God began? And obviously throughout scripture we read he continues his intention for mankind to express sexuality. And what do we do with adultery, homosexuality, and transgenderism in view of that? Is that 2 questions now? Maybe. Sorry.
That's all right. That's right. It's not on the list. Thank you, sir. All right. Go back to this one there. There we go. Get everybody back. I hope you all wrote it down. My pen ran out of ink right as we sat down, starting to listen to him. So I'm going to go for there. Let me clarify for you writing again your statement. I just put down 3 statements or 3 categories: adultery, homosexuality, transgenderism. There are some subcategories. Damon, you've been in youth ministry. Maybe you want to talk on fornication is the biblical term, sexual intimacy between people who are not married. That's a significant issue in the culture today, even in the church, and maybe I should say in the church. And how do we address that? I'm sure you've had to address that as you just talk to students, trying to encourage them. Maybe some caveats in the other 2. If you want to write your statement toward any specific topic of this, now we're living out our lives, as Damon was talking, just the whole issue of maybe you want to take it more positively. What is the biblical understanding of sexual intimacy? When and where and how? What's the purpose? I heard you talk about that at one point. Question, comment, anybody to start us out? What was his question?
Something along the lines of, how does this understanding shape how we would love God with our whole heart, soul, and body? I don't know. I've never heard translated body. I've always seen mind or might, depending which one you're in. But I pulled it up, and it looks like at least in Matthew 22, for you shall love the Lord your God. It is the word love is the agapao, so the agape love. So it's a self-sacrificial love. I have, strangely enough, had 1 or 2 unbelievers walk up to me and start accusing Christians of being inappropriate with God, and then you just have to explain that there's multiple words, and this is not the word we're using here. And they knew all of that. They just didn't they were just throwing stuff at the wall to see what they expect, basically. But
yes, right.
So it's I would say there's when we're dealing with adultery and stuff. Clearly, it's more than just that they had the physical love. It's also the fact that it betrays the emotional love. So, I mean, I guess in the same, the Bible, he mentioned there's 2 kinds of adultery in the Bible, and one is physical, but the other was, and we talked about this earlier, tangentially, but it's in that Exodus, was it 34 passage, where it was also literally adultery against God to go after idols. So in the same way that it almost used to be maybe that people would be more offended at adultery than they would be at idolatry. Now it almost feels like we're swapped, but we would be more offended at idolatry if somebody had an idol in their basement than we would be if they were sleeping with the next door neighbor's wife or whatever. But God seems to view those 2 in the same way and uses the same language to describe it. Maybe that's what Damon was looking for.
Yeah, as you're talking there, Josh, and Damon was talking, another angle that maybe somebody would want to write about: anthropology, from those things that we do, the sins that we get involved in that distort the image, either in marriage, out of marriage, in our own lives, homosexuality, transgenderism perhaps. I didn't put down divorce, because here in the divorce passage, Matthew 19, difficult statements there. Where we look at where he talks about, oh shoot, I can't. Oh, there it is, verse 9. Matthew 19, verse 9. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for porneia and marries another woman commits adultery. So divorce is involved in this question too. Maybe that would help you as you think through theologically this topic and then write a statement. This is what God's saying. This is the truth. And grounded in scripture, that would help you out. Oh boy, I wish my pen didn't run out of ink. I was trying to write down, we are not under the Old Testament, right? So that means all those laws, the sexual purity laws, they don't apply. I remember as a kid, I'm going to answer with a statement. I'm going to particular statement. I remember as a child, as a teenager, thinking, when women and sexuality started to be an interest in my mind, as a young boy, the hormones start racing, and those verses in the Old Testament, and I'm sure I heard sermons about fornication. You don't do it, but always using the Old Testament verses to say it. Now there are verses in the New Testament too, but I remember Old Testament passages in particular. How do you relate to the Old Testament and all of its laws concerning these different areas of life and relationships? A statement, I guess, is what I'm looking for anybody to add in here. Should we use the Old Testament? Should we not? If we're not under the Old Testament, what does that mean? I understand that's another question.
Well, that gets into, on this topic, not just this topic, that gets into should you use the Old Testament on any topic to some extent? Mm-hmm. And the answer is yes, Christians are not directly under the law, they are under grace. I would argue there's a different dispensation, but that doesn't mean that you have a different God between the two. Mm-hmm. So the Old Testament law, if you look at what Paul said in Romans, it showed us that it showed people that we could not earn our way into heaven because God literally gave them the blueprint, and it doesn't work. Not that the law doesn't work, but that people living up to the law doesn't work on the people end. So that's how you deal with the law. So some people have tried to parse out that there's maybe the ceremonial law and the spiritual law and the three parts of the law. The problem is in the Old Testament there is one law. But when you get into things like adultery and things like that, God didn't somehow change his mind on it.
I'm thinking of one passage that I remember as a young teenager. If a man finds a girl who's a virgin, who's not engaged, seizes her, lies with her, this is Deuteronomy 22, and they are discovered, then the man who lay with her shall give her to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver. She shall become his wife because he has violated her. He cannot divorce her all his days. There used to be an expression that we said, shotgun weddings, meaning the dad of the girl is there. He's going to guarantee that you marry her and make her legal because you fornicated with her.
I thought shotgun wedding was they just did it really fast. That makes a lot more sense.
Yes. The husband's trying to force that to you. We've, in a sense, I think as a church, and I'm just looking from my own pastoral experience, couples sleep together. I've had a few. One couple in particular I'm thinking of, when I was a chaplain in the Air Force, came in, they'd heard a sermon that I preached on marriage, and they came and said, we'd like to have that kind of wedding, or kind of marriage. I said, great, that's neat. But by the way, we've been sleeping together. Oh, so what should we do now? That's what we've been talking about. And I eventually conducted a wedding at Hardin Simmons University. There, they used the chapel there on the campus there in Abilene, and a very nice couple, very wanting to honor the Lord, but struggling in that area. All right, so it's just a prominent thing. What would we say? What would we do? I'm going a little bit further than what we're talking about. Another question about this area of not just sexual intimacy, but our sexual presentation that you all might have. Well, I didn't end that one. Anybody else on the Old Testament and its wisdom for how to apply today?
Even Jesus said he didn't come to abolish the law; he came to fulfill it.
Good.
And through we have the righteousness of God through Christ Jesus, and so the law, we are saved by grace, but even Jesus said, "I didn't come to abolish the law, to fulfill it." So yes, the Old Testament still stands.
Yeah.
There's some things that culturally that, of course, are different, and I think Josh mentioned about this sacrificial, ceremonial laws, etc. But if Jesus said he didn't come to abolish the law, then that's what I'm going with.
Yeah, you bet. The specific kingdom relationship we don't have with the nation of Israel, but the moral law, that's where people that look at ethics look at the Old Testament and say it's high ethics, but does it relate to us? Yes, the moral law does. I mean, we wouldn't say that the Ten Commandments don't apply to us. Now, we say that except for the Sabbath, because we're not under that ceremonial practice. But is there a Sabbath principle even with that one?
So
Yeah,
do you
good
hold to the
good
three
good
verses
comment
of the law?
there, Ben. Good comment.
Do you hold to the 3 parts of the law? Like you think it's
I think it's it's a helpful. That's hard because it isn't written as 3 parts. They're all intertwined.
the book of
together.
the law?
But it as to understanding what the comments are that were, like Ben just said, yes, we're under the law. I didn't come but to fulfill it, or he came to fulfill for sure in himself the ceremonial parts that pointed to Messiah and his sacrifice. That's a question we all have to wade through. I think personally that the moral principles, and so even in that Deuteronomy 22 passage, as a pastor, I would say we're not under that as the nation and its stipulations, but there's a principle there. Are you protecting the purity of the girls that you're around, is what I would say to a young man. If you're to take initiative, that's what you're to be all about. And from the woman's side, are you enticing a boy to treat you like a married woman and you're not married? All right, so there's a conversation on both sides.
I think what you said, Dr. Dodds, in terms of the moral principles still holds, because Jesus said even if you lust after a woman,
yeah,
that is adultery. And so the law according to 10 Commandments was talking about physical, but Jesus said the attitude toward toward that moral choice is what really separates obedience from disobedience.
Yeah. Let's shift to homosexuality just for the sake of time, and transgenderism. That's more a present tense topic. How does a Christian respond to that? One context I was in, I was at a church conference convention out in Denver, and sitting at these tables, and we were discussing, the whole issue of homosexuality, because that was what the denomination was struggling with at that point. I'm not a part of that denomination, and I saw the inside of it and wondering where they're going with it. I was with the conservative part element that was in the denomination. But one person at our table says there's only 6 verses in the Bible that talk about homosexuality. As if to say, well, it's, I heard it from another person on a blog just yesterday. My wife and I, she was looking around, and this person was talking about shepherds in the church that are not saying the right things. And he used an example, I don't remember the pastor's name, where in a mega church saying, we should not emphasize that which the Bible doesn't speak a lot about. Yeah, it's an important issue, but it's a secondary issue. Are we as Christians making too much of homosexuality with only 6 verses? Now, again, I'm trying to not predispose with my face and tone of voice or anything. Sorry. How do we deal with that one? Evangeline, do you talk to any people in counseling that are, you ever had an experience with people that are struggling with that temptation? Or
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say I agree with that statement that it's important, but also if you make it important, it will be important. To me, it's I don't know, does that make sense? I felt like trying to be careful here, but
yeah,
but yeah, I just agree with that statement. Like it is important, but it's not really that important because God sees the heart. And I see people in counseling, and I don't have enough experience in counseling with this topic, by the way, but I just say this based on my personal experience. I have um, a lot of gay friends growing up, and up to this day, I still have like connections with them, like we still talk, and they know my heart when it comes to this topic, and they know who I am, and they know that I'm a believer, and I have my boundaries, so they know that boundaries. But yeah, I think to me it's really hard to it's not hard, but it's hard because it's personal for me. I guess I should say
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I agree with that statement that it's not really. I always tell my friends that I do not judge them because of they choose to have that kind of life, but they also know that I do not tolerate um that kind of thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but they know my heart about it, and they know that I love them and I care for them. But what I was trying to say is that as a believer, though, we need to be better at it, in showing them what really Christ love for them, because it's hard, and I don't know. It's personal for me, so that's why I'm trying to like be trying to explain myself better. I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, I understand that. The phrase that's thrown out that I've heard different times is the clobber verses. We clobber people with the verses, meaning this is a subject that really touches on our personhood in a sense, so we have a difficulty with it. And a question that people posed about different issues, but this issue is important. What is the most important thing for that person to do? Well, it's to surrender their life to Jesus Christ, change their orientation in sexuality. Jesus will do that.
yeah.
Maybe with some people, that's the issue that they need to deal with. So I don't really know their heart, but we need to keep the main thing, which is Christ and a relationship with Him. Ben, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say it's because it's so prevalent in society, and being that I work at a public
Yeah.
school, it's it's not like, where if it's a private schools, you can kind of address those. If it's a Christian based school, you can address those issues, but you have to be very sensitive. You have to, as you said, you have to preach Christ, and then and you can get your salvation through Christ, and then leave the rest to God. But it's a very sensitive subject because I have at least at least 2 students in my 5 classes that that are gay. It might not be openly, but it's, you know, it's definitely obvious, and throughout the school it's definitely an issue. But I can't say, well, you're going to, God is the final judge, and so we have to stand our ground, as you said, Evangeline. We definitely have to do that, and people have to know where we stand. But we can't tell others where they should stand. We just have to lead. We are responsible to lead others to Christ. That should be our main
Yeah.
focus. But it's hard though, because I have students that I love that, they are gay openly, and so it can be a touchy subject and a difficult issue to deal with,
Mhm.
because it's in our face. And
Yeah.
even on the
Yeah.
SAT, I think on the PSAT, now you have the choice to male, female, or other, or something like that.
Yeah.
When they take the test, they designate their gender.
It's on the one hand, yes, there have been groups and people that made too much of it in the specific sense that they either viewed it or sometimes even not just viewed it, but actually taught that it was worse than other sins.
Yeah.
It's not worse than other sins. I'm looking at like 1 Corinthians 6 right here, where it's very clear that there were people who did that. There were people who did a whole laundry list of other stuff. And Paul says, but you were washed.
Right.
Paul had no problem saying that somebody who had struggled with that could come find Christ. Now, on the other side of that, these are homosexuality, and we're about to get to transgenderism, are some of the more prevalent ones you see in society. They're it's one way it's been put to me is that throughout church history, the list of sins might not have changed, but there were certain ones that were almost the fight in the culture at any given time. These seem to be the fight of our day. So on the one hand, it's
Transgenderism you shifted to, is what you're describing? Or?
all of the sexual ones. I mean, it just keeps picking it up. They just keep picking another one. So transgenderism is kind of the latest one, but they're using all the same arguments, and it's following the same way the homosexuality one did 20, 30 probably years ago. I was alive, so I don't know exactly. But as far as how we deal with them, part of the reason that people struggle to deal with this one is that it is actually become viewed as an identity category, not a behavioral category. If you want a really well done book on how that all came about, you want Carl Trueman's Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
Right,
Really helped me in just later high school trying to figure out what people were talking about with all this, to understand when they say identity, they're not talking about this is what I do. They view this as who they are. So one thing I found, strangely enough, I found this out where people just walk, they figure out you're the Christian at work, they walk up, they ask you, so what do you think about this? And they start playing Stump the Christian. The people who want to know how you view homosexuality or transgenderism, sometimes you'll never ever know which of the three around you are struggling with that until like way later. So when I say you have to be gentle and careful in how you address these questions, that's not just when somebody comes up and says, hey, I'm struggling with this. That's whenever you have no idea what they're struggling with. I mean, you can make this argument for any sin, but these ones in particular today, you have to answer this in a way that is very clear biblically. You make it very clear that that the Bible doesn't view this as a behavior, or excuse me, does not view this as an identity that you have that is innate in you.
Yeah.
They view it as a behavior that you've chosen. And then you actually have to be very clear to say the Bible doesn't view this as worse than other bad behaviors, other sins, but the Bible actually gives the solution to all sin. And getting all of that out in a 2-minute conversation can be really interesting.
Yes.
But
Right.
So to answer your original question, I wouldn't say, yes, there are those who make too much of it, nor do I think we should diminish it because it's only mentioned in so many places in the Bible, because the Bible is still very clear on it. It's just being clear to say, well, how do we deal with this? And the answer is we deal with it like we do any other sin.
Right. with the dynamic of understand their personal context too.
Mm.
Answer the question I asked. These 6 verses, some of them are not as clear in the sense that he's really addressing just homosexuality there, but they are all clear that this sin is a sin. And I like the 1 Corinthians 6 passage is exactly what you were saying, Josh. But you were washed. There's hope. In the Romans 1 passage, there's an interesting observation there. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Somebody's ever said he's talking about the image of God. We reject God's revelation in creation, verses 18, 19, and 20, Romans 1. Verse 21 and following, for even though they knew God, they didn't honor him, give thanks, became futile in their mind. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing wise, they became fool and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God, for an image in the form of corruptible man. So he's shifting into things that we do in our personhood that pervert the image of God in us. And so this is a significant passage for our discussion here of anthropology. Therefore, God gave them over in the lust of their heart to impurity, so their bodies would be dishonored among them. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, worshipped and served the creature rather than the creator. And here's the verses 26, 27. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. Now, notice how Paul wrote it. He begins with the women. For the women exchanged their natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way, also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another. Men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. Spoken in a Roman culture, it would come across with just a slightly powerful, more nuance than we're seeing here. To begin with, a woman in the Greco-Roman culture, women were created for men. So homosexual women were unnatural. Yeah, they occurred, but not as much as men. In the Roman culture, men did pederasty, if that's the way of saying the word. They had little boys, homosexuals, that serviced them sexually. That they felt was natural.
If I understand it right, it wasn't even that they viewed the guy as gay. It was a man, especially like the head of the Roman big, rich guy in the household.
It was just to satisfy his sexuality. Yep, that's really all it was. There was homosexuality, but it was forced. These people. So the way he's writing it, they would read this: for the women exchange their natural function for unnatural. Oh, yeah, that's not right. But men change their function for. Well, wait a minute. So there's something a little bit more powerful going on in that passage that the men in that culture, more dominant, not as dominant as the Jewish culture when it came to homosexuality. Transgenderism. Let's touch on that just in the last few minutes here. Why is it exploding amongst young girls as much as it is amongst young guys? Now that's in our culture. Masashi, you haven't stepped in. I don't know what's the Japanese culture when it comes to these sexual sins. Is homosexuality and transgenderism an issue in Japan or not?
Yeah, it's getting bigger. I mean, Japanese culture following West Americans,
so it's accepted and
it's getting more acceptable in the society, but not as big as the American culture.
How do you see our culture? Are we just making, like Josh was saying, it's people, it's just the choice. It's not really an action. It's an identity, rather, maybe is what you were describing. What are you seeing in American culture? Why is this an issue for us?
Yeah.
What is the issue?
Yeah, I went to Lawrence, Kansas, on the June 1st, and there was gay Pride Month.
Pride Month starting off on the 1st.
And lots of people wear a rainbow color shirt or flag. And I was kind of shocked that, there are so many people that affirm the, transgenderism and kind of stuff. So, yeah, I was shocked about, there are actually many people who affirm that the trend or transgenderism.
Is that just because it's a university town? Did you see?
Oh yeah, so because this university town, but you know, I have heard the American society are divided between, you know, the affirming genderism, transgenderism, and not affirming transgenderism. But I felt the reality of that, you know, division. Yeah. So
How do we respond? How does the church respond? How do Christians respond? There are people that have had to apologize because they were just over the top, you know, not doing like what we were talking, meaning they were treating people that bear the image of God, though they've made choices that are unbiblical, you know, in ungodly ways. But how would we respond? How should we relate? Boy, I had a question for me there. I can't think of it. It'll come back. How would we speak? What should be the, all right. That's what I was thinking of. Just heard of another conference. Revoice is what it's called. It was held a couple of years ago in Presbyterian Church in PCA Church in St. Louis. And now it's a couple of years later, and it's going to, I don't think it's in Kansas City. I think it's over in Ohio. But anyway, it's people that are affirming that they are either homosexual, but they're Christian homosexual. They are Christian binary, Christian, you know, in the whole gamut there. Response. Is it possible to be and affirm that and still be a committed Christian growing in Christ? Now, that's asking a yes/no question, but I don't want a yes/no answer. Josh, yeah.
Well, as with any sin, do Christians struggle with temptation to and sexual, like committing sin? Yes. So it is definitely possible to be a Christian, be tempted in that way, and not somehow just magically lose your salvation.
So would you label yourself a homosexual Christian?
No, I'm getting
okay.
there. But
all right. I'm sorry.
But again, like I said, they're arguing. If you see, for them, this isn't a behavioral issue. This is an identity issue. It is actually, they argue, not what I do, it is who I am. By the time you get, you know, you just go into Truman's book, by the time you get to that understanding, you have, whether you realized it or not, bought into some form of a postmodern identity framework. So at the very least, when they're arguing for this, they have to be some kind of like a post-evangelical, post-conservative. If you don't know, that's kind of a view that's arguing
the ex-evangelical. Is that what you're talking about? Those people. Is that the term?
Is ex-evangelical another one, or is that just the idea that left evangelicalism? Post-evangelicalism
is
kind of like.
Right.
I did a whole presentation. Actually, I did a presentation for class, and then I got to present my presentation for church in like 4 weeks or something. So that was fun. But basically what I argued in church when I presented it was, there's this group that is arguing that they're arguing, yes, you can have the Bible, but you can't have an exclusive Bible because they're trying to blend postmodernism. So usually by the time you're arguing for that level of identity framework, you've already walked away from Jesus as being the only way to heaven. But assuming they haven't gone that far down the rabbit hole, at the very least, they're arguing that they can have Jesus and have their sin. The Bible doesn't like leave you with any alternative. At the very least, I'd say that if they have salvation, they're clearly walking away from sanctification to make that declaration. You could also make there's a pretty good argument to be made that by the time they're walking away, that apostatizing in that area, they're usually apostatizing in enough others where they probably don't have salvation. But again, that comes down to more the individual, less like broad brushing everybody.
Yeah, talking to them personally. There have been people that have been criticizing that conference because it seems to be validating identify yourself by your sin.
Exactly.
But yet I see a cultural perspective. I'd want to have a dialogue with somebody because they might just be saying, this is the sin I'm struggling with, so I'm going to identify it. AA, the first statement in AA, I'm an alcoholic, but I've been sober or clean for how many years, or they have to say how long they from the last drink type thing. So it's an issue. It's dominant. It's in our culture. Next week we're going to continue this discussion, but in a different vein. We're going to introduce the topic of hamartiology. What does the Bible say about sin? Next week, Damon, you're going to talk about the fall into sin. Just what is that? Was it in fact, the questions that I'm asking you. Jeremiah, we haven't addressed you. You weren't on with us tonight, but you're going to talk about just what is the nature of sin. We fall into sin, but then just talk about sin. Because we need to understand that, be able to relate that to people. This is what sin is. Then we're going to talk specifically about two different categories, inherited sin and imputed sin. Then that last week, we'll talk about personal sin, Christian sin, the impartible sin, and death there. But questions, anybody, about next week? Evangeline, you're going to talk about inherited sin. So look in the text and see what that implies. I'm going to talk about imputed. Anybody question? Damon and Jeremiah aren't on this tonight. Final comments, statements, anybody? Well, good discussion. The Lord bless you all as you go through the rest of the week. And I'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Enjoy relaxing there, Ben.
I will get some sleep and try to get caught up on some things.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. Take care, everybody.
Thanks again. Good night, everyone.
Good night, all.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Josh, thanks for reminding me to start that time.